to show you how to learn some new Photoshop advanced techniques like masking, making selections, using layer blending modes, adjustment layers, filters and effects, so on and so forth. So we're just basically going to use a bunch of images that I got from some tutorial way back in the day, and unfortunately I don't still have that source. Otherwise I'd love to give them attribution. So I'm going to begin by going File, Place, Embedded. Instead of Linked, Linked will link that file to a different place on your computer, and if you move that file, it could become problematic in the future. So I always like to go File, Place, Embedded, and that will make that new file live in this document. So I'm going to look for this folder and this file here. And this is going to be my background image. It's okay to stretch it out to fill up that space because I made this document 9 by 13, which is a little bit taller and slightly wider than a US letter size document. And then when I've done that transformation, I'm going to click the check mark up here to apply that transformation. So that's going to be my background image. I'm going to place another image on top of this by going File, Place, Embedded. And this time I'm looking for the skateboarder image. Perfect. Don't need to resize it. He's a good size right there. And I'll do the check mark. What I'm trying to do is I want to make a selection around the skateboarder to select those pixels and then eventually get rid of the background. Instead of selecting the background and deleting the background, I want to show you how to use a masking technique. And this button down here is going to show us how to add a layer mask once I have that selection. So the first thing to talk about is I want to select this layer, and I want to use a selection method. Okay, there's lots of different selection tools in Photoshop that you can choose from. For this job, I believe the quick selection tool is probably going to be my best. When I choose this quick selection tool, now I can click and drag, and Photoshop guesses what pixels I'm trying to select based on kind of their color and their contrast, and it does a pretty good job. Okay, I'm adding to this selection. You can, whenever you're using a selection method, you can see up here, there's an add selection and subtract from selection. So I'm just going to keep it as add at the moment, and I'm going to keep adding. And you'll notice that when I get in some tricky areas, it accidentally starts grabbing and selecting that background, which I don't want. But that's okay at this stage. I'm just going to keep going. Okay. So now it selected most of the skateboard image. We've got a little bit extra over here, a little bit extra over here, and then a lot extra in between his legs. So now I'm going to go up to the minus selection, and I'm going to click and drag, and it quickly kind of deciphered what I don't want. And I'm going to leave some of this messy, like I'm making a few mistakes here on purpose. Same thing with the hands. I'll just do a little bit of the hand, and then we'll leave the rest there. Because we can adjust that and make changes to that using our layer mask. So once I have something selected, group of pixels, now I'm going to go to this button here at the bottom of my layers palette and click add layer mask. And what that's going to do is it's going to create another thumbnail that's linked to this image. In this thumbnail here that has the black and the white, that is considered our layer mask. You can adjust a layer mask by using a paintbrush tool. Okay, the paintbrush tool, we can adjust the type of brush we're going to use. We can adjust the hardness and adjust the size up there. And you'll notice that as I paint with white, you'll see a few changes on that thumbnail there. It brings back those pixels that are masked away. When I change this color to black, now it looks like I'm erasing pixels, but I'm actually masking them. I'm covering them up. So that's why we can't see them. I can make my brush bigger and smaller. A good shortcut key on the keyboard is the brackets right next to the letter P. And you can see your cursor get bigger and smaller, so that helps me there. And then here I can just zoom in. Oops, sorry about that. I could zoom in and mask away pixels that I don't need really carefully. So I'm just going to go really fast just for the purpose of this tutorial. I think you kind of get the idea here. One last thing I want to show you about the mask is because we do have control over our brush. Let's say I want to have a nice soft edge here. Paint that back. Another good shortcut key on the keyboard to know that you can toggle back and forth with these by hitting the X key. That'll toggle back and forth. So that's a helpful, whenever I'm doing masking, I keep my hand on the keyboard and make those adjustments over there. If I want to make a soft edge, I can make my brush really big, and I can change the softness, or the hardness, I should say. And, oops. And that's a good way to control that edge if you want to do a soft mask. So it's really up to you. It depends, what you're working with for a photo collage. But I could go in here and kind of clean some of this up. So you kind of get the idea. But you have to always make sure that that is selected. If I accidentally click on this thumbnail, looks like the newer version of Photoshop won't actually let me paint on there, which is good. Maybe it's because it's a smart object. But going back here, you always want to make sure that's selected when you're playing around with your masking. All right, so let's zoom out. So that's kind of the first step of what I'm trying to do. I want to take this layer now, and I'm going to click and drag to duplicate the layer. I can click and drag it to duplicate that way. I could also right-click, click duplicate layer, or I can go up to layer, duplicate layer. So there's three different options you have. I like the click and drag on top of the plus, and that's probably my fastest and most efficient way to do that. What I want to show you next is blending modes, okay? I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. Blending modes, you can change right here, okay? Wherever, by default, it's always going to say normal, and it's normally going to stack up all of your layers in the normal blending mode. But you have this option here where you can change the way that layer lays on top of and interacts with the layers below it. So that's kind of a fun thing to play around with. And then, of course, you can also change, let's say I do multiply, I can also change the opacity of how that layer is affecting that. So let's go back to normal for a sec. And I want to show you this one option I have for, see how the background's kind of gritty, has a lot of texture to it, and the image itself in front doesn't kind of match that at all. So I want to add like a little bit of noise. There's a few different ways I can do this, but this is kind of a nice one that I like. You've got filter, and you've got filter gallery and all these other cool things that you can do to change the effects of your images. We're going to show you a new one called other, and then over to high pass. When you do the high pass filter, it's going to gray out and show you the slider where if you put it all the way to one direction, it doesn't seem to do much. But I like to use this somewhere kind of in the 5 range where I see a little bit of detail. So let's go to 5. That seems like a good spot for this. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And now I'm going to change my layer blending mode to overlay. All right, I feel like when I turn that on and off, you can see that difference a little bit. It adds a little bit of noise, adds a little bit of grit and texture to the background. So, and then I'm going to change that opacity down to something like 75%. And that looks good to me. Some new advanced things in Photoshop. We're going to learn how to use some adjustment layers. So let's go ahead and place another file on top of our background image. And let's do this one here. Okay, I'll zoom back out, kind of stretch this to overlap the edge. Click up here. Let's move that layer below that skateboarder. All right, and I want to have this layer kind of interact with the layer below it. So I'm going to go ahead once again and let's try multiply. Change that opacity down just a little bit. Okay. And then we're going to use a layer blending mode. So, sorry, not a layer blending mode, an adjustment layer. So I'm going to click on that. I'm going to go to this button down here below. And these are all different types of adjustments that you can make. I'm going to click on levels. And levels is going to appear right above it. And it shows me what's called a histogram. This histogram will have sliders below it. And I just want you to play around with those sliders. And we'll go into more detail on what a histogram is and all these sliders, what we're actually doing a little bit later. But I just want to teach you that, so this layer right now is affecting everything below it. So it's a layer adjustment layer that affects everything below it. If I wanted to just affect this layer here, there is a button right here. When I hover over it, it says this adjustment affects all layers below. Click to clip a layer. Now it has this little arrow, and it's showing me that it only adjusts this layer now. All right, it's a very subtle adjustment. I probably could have chosen a different image for that, but if you turn it on and off, you can kind of see what it did. So when I went here, it kind of took away some of that nice texture that I had, and now it reappears when I do something like that. So I feel like we're in a good spot. So let's go ahead and add another image. So we're going to go File, Place Embedded. And we'll find another image that is going to make this a little more interesting. We'll add some wings to the skateboarder. So once we place it, I'm thinking about maybe flipping these around. So to flip them around, go up to Edit, scroll down to Transform, and choose Flip Horizontal. There you go. Place those where you like them. Then I need to go ahead and click the check mark to apply that transformation, and now we can go ahead and play with that blending mode a little bit. Find a blending mode that makes those look like they'll fit with this collage. I'm thinking about multiply. And then what I'm going to do is go ahead and start masking away just that little edge we see from that layer. So I'm going to use a larger brush with a very soft edge, so I'll turn the hardness down. I'll kind of paint and mask away that edge. We'll go ahead and we'll go File, Place Embedded. We'll add one more image here of some birds flying in the sky. Here I played around with the layer blending mode. It's very indecisive. I had a hard time figuring out what looked good. But then eventually settled on one and played around with the opacity. Once I played around with the opacity, then I created another layer mask where I painted with white and black on that layer mask to get rid of some of the background and make some of the background where the birds were reappear. Then I created a layer adjustment layer, and I chose hue saturation, and I scrubbed down the saturation to get rid of that yellow color, and then it was time to save it. So here I went in, go File, Save As, saved it as a Photoshop document, named it Photo Collage Exercise Josh Heckendorf. Made sure I saved it in my Creative Clouds file folder. So that way it's saved up in the cloud. Check my format that it was Photoshop. And that was it. Hope this video helped teach you a little bit about masking,